Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to dig into a really significant shift in American economic policy, Trumponomics.
Hmm.
Think of it as trying to understand this huge event that didn't just reshape the U.S. economy, but really sent ripples across the globe.
Absolutely.
And for you, our listener, especially if you're gearing up for the UPSC exams, getting a grip on Trumponomics is, well, pretty vital for staying on top of major international developments.
It really is. And look, navigating these complex economic ideas can feel pretty daunting sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
But that's why we're here. Think of this deep dive as maybe your guide through the key ideas of Trumponomics, the logic behind it, how it worked in practice, and the wider effects.
So what's the plan?
Our mission today is clear. Pull out the crucial insights from our source material, which today is based on some insightful analysis in the Hindu, and give you a clear, concise understanding, no overload.
Good.
This is exactly the kind of daily UPSC mains current discussion that can be so important, and it might even pop up in prelims too.
Okay, let's unpack this then. What immediately jumps out from the material is that Trumponomics wasn't just, fiddling around the edges.
Not at all.
It was a real break from decades of how America had thought about economics. We're talking about moving away from principles like free trade, deregulation, this whole idea of global economic integration.
Right. Things that had been pretty much standard for a long time.
And maybe nothing sums it up better than Trump's own line that tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. That's quite something, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And it really signals a fundamental rethink of that whole post-Cold War economic consensus. What's interesting here is to look at the foundations, what this new approach was actually built on.
Okay.
The sources point to a couple of main pillars. The first one is this idea of reindustrializing America.
Right. And the core argument there, as the sources lay it out, is that the U.S. had really taken a hit from globalization, especially manufacturing jobs going overseas, particularly to China. But it wasn't just about jobs numbers, was it? The material talks about how this led to communities declining, more social problems in those old industrial areas. It paints a picture of a much wider impact.
It really does. The source material emphasizes that, look, the exact numbers on job losses vary. You see estimates like 2 million, maybe even up to 5 million in the early 2000s.
Wow.
But there's a general agreement that manufacturing is vital, not just for the economy, but for, middle-class prosperity, national resilience. Understanding that connection is pretty key to grasping the why behind Trumponomics.
And that feeds straight into the second foundation you mentioned, national security concerns. It's not just jobs, it's about being strategically independent. The argument being that a major power like the U.S. just can't afford to rely on other countries for essential stuff, especially with geopolitical tensions.
Yeah, particularly for critical materials. The sources specifically mention things like steel, aluminum, semiconductors.
It's a compelling point when you think about supply chains and vulnerability.
It really raises that question.
Yeah.
And the quote from Trump, if you don't have steel, you don't have a country, it just perfectly captures that viewpoint.
Very stark terms.
It frames economic self-sufficiency as fundamentally a national security issue. And for UPSC aspirants thinking about India's own strategic goals, this link between economic policy and national security is a theme that comes up again and again in international relations.
Okay, so reindustrialization, national security. Then there's the critique of free trade itself.
Right.
Trumponomics didn't just see flaws in the outcomes, it questioned whether free trade was even inherently fair to begin with.
Yeah. The argument, according to our sources, really focused on what they saw as unfair practices by other nations, China being the main target.
So what kind of practices?
Things like government subsidies for their industries, using cheap labor, and the text kind of implies this could sometimes be coercive labor.
Okay.
And of course, intellectual property theft. That was a huge point of contention.
What's interesting there is how it flips the conventional wisdom, right? Free trade is usually sold as beneficial for everyone.
Exactly. But Trumponomics essentially said, well, the playing field isn't level. Sticking to the standard free market rules when others aren't actually puts American businesses at a disadvantage.
And the analysis in the Hindu points to those government subsidies as a key issue.
Yes, although it's worth noting, economists often debate how you define these subsidies and what their real impact is. Some see them as clearly unfair advantages. Others might view them as legitimate tools for development.
And the evidence they pointed to for this imbalance, the trade deficit?
That was the big number. Those persistent deficits, anywhere from $500 billion up to $1 trillion a year.
Huge figures.
They were seen as proof that the system was tilted, that it was weakening U.S. sovereignty, and basically just shipping wealth out of the country.
Okay, so if that's the diagnosis, then tariffs become the main prescription, the central tool. What exactly were they trying to achieve with these tariffs?
Well, the source material lays out a few key goals. First, just cut that trade deficit. Make foreign goods more expensive so people buy domestic.
Makes sense.
Second, help revive those domestic industries. Give them some breathing room, some protection from foreign competition so they can hopefully rebuild and reinvest.
Okay.
And third, kind of interestingly, was to address what they saw as a currency distortion.
How so?
The argument was that because the U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency, it stays artificially high, sort of overvalued. This stops the trade imbalance from correcting itself naturally through the dollar weakening. So tariffs were seen as a mechanism to kind of force that correction,
That's quite a technical point, and definitely something for anyone studying international economics for UPSC to get their head around currency valuation trade impacts.
Absolutely essential.
But, I mean, we all heard the warnings from economists about tariffs, right? Higher prices for consumers, making the economy less efficient. What did the sources say about those downsides?
Oh, yeah. Those warnings were definitely noted. Increased consumer prices, reduced efficiency. Those were the standard concerns.
But Trumponomics had a counter.
It did. It focused on what the source calls second-round effects. The idea was, okay, tariffs might raise import prices initially, but if imports fall, the U.S. dollar could actually strengthen or appreciate.
Potentially canceling out the price hike.
That was the theory, yeah, that currency appreciation could neutralize the direct price impact so consumers wouldn't necessarily feel it so much. And they also argued the overall inflationary hit, the course estimates maybe 0.3 to 0.6 percentage points would be, well, manageable.
Manageable in their view. Okay. So with those goals in mind, what did the analysis suggest were the potential real-world consequences?
Well, it's interesting how they saw it all fitting together because tariffs weren't the only thing, right?
Right, the other trump cards, as the source put it. It wasn't just tariffs in isolation.
No, exactly. The source stresses that. There were other key parts to the strategy, tax cuts, for instance.
How did they fit in?
The idea was partly to offset any higher costs businesses faced from tariffs on inputs, but also just to give them more capital to invest and expand. Create jobs.
Okay, tax cuts.
Deregulation. The Hindu analysis mentions efforts often targeting environmental rules, financial oversight, basically aiming to cut the costs and burdens of doing business. Make America more competitive.
Right.
And then there was the big push for energy independence, ramping up domestic oil production. The logic there was lower energy costs across the board, which also helps keep inflation down.
So you can really see how these pieces were meant to work together, can't you?
Yeah, they were designed to be mutually reinforcing.
Forming this coherent, if unconventional, economic model, as the source puts it. It really seems like the priorities shifted, didn't it, towards strategic autonomy, bringing jobs back, boosting national pride.
Absolutely.
Even if that meant maybe sacrificing some pure economic efficiency along the way, linking economic policy so directly to national defense and domestic issues.
That's a really crucial point. Trumponomics basically challenged that long-held idea that economic efficiency should always be the #1 goal. And the source makes an interesting comparison here with developing nations, like India, actually. Countries that have always had to balance chasing efficiency with other big goals, social needs, strategic aims.
That's a very relevant parallel for UPSC candidates looking at India's own development path.
Definitely.
It was a real perspective shift. And the source does acknowledge the criticisms, doesn't it? That this approach could be seen as insular, maybe destabilizing for the global economy.
It does. Those criticisms were definitely there. But, as the material also notes, for Trump supporters, the whole idea of making America great again, well, that justified potential disruptions. Any temporary pain was seen as worth it for the bigger goal.
Right.
And, regardless of how you judge its long-term success, and the jury might still be out on some aspects, the source concludes that Trumponomics has undeniably shifted the conversation around economics. It's forced people to look much harder at the trade-offs involved in globalization. It's raised serious questions about whether those traditional free trade ideas are always sustainable or fair, and it introduced this more assertive language of economic nationalism that we've seen echo elsewhere too.
So it's changed the terms of the debate.
Massively.
Yeah.
For anyone preparing for UPSC, understanding this shift, its arguments, its impacts, it's absolutely key for making sense of current global economic trends and how they might affect India.
Okay, so let's try and sum up our deep dive into Trumponomics, drawing on that Hindu analysis. We've seen it's basically a nationalist, self-sufficient, and strategically focused economic philosophy.
Pragmatic in its own way.
Tariffs were the main tool people talked about, but they were really part of this bigger strategy trying to reshape trade and boost American industry back home.
Precisely. And as you, our listener, continue preparing for your UPSC exams, just remember, understanding this break from the old economic orthodoxy is so important for putting current global economic shifts into context.
Right, understanding their implications.
Exactly. This look at Trumponomics offers really valuable insights for understanding international economics and policy today.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on, especially with that UPSC prep in mind. What is the right balance between chasing pure economic efficiency globally and prioritizing things like national security and social well-being within your own country?
It's a tough one.
It's a really complex question, and it doesn't just apply to the U.S. under Trumponomics. It's highly relevant to India's own economic policy choices, too. Something to reflect on.
Definitely food for thought.
And hey, if you found this deep dive useful for your daily UPSC mains current affairs work, please do give us a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and maybe leave a comment if you have more questions.
We always like hearing from you.
We do. And just a reminder, our source for today's discussion was analysis published in The Hindu.